So far we know that deportations have gone on, to reach record highs in the United States in the past 10 to 15 years. At the moment we have a detention quota, so at any given moment there's capacity to detain up to 34,000 individuals across around 300 facilities in the United States. And so you have this huge deportation regime, right? So again, we've heard about this. And in terms of understanding what we know about health and people who face detention, we know that there have been deaths in detention, generally a lack of proper medical care, and little to no professional attention, right? So there's some work on just in general what happens to immigrants who are detained, and the outlooks aren't so good, right? And we also know that the detention process in itself is very taxing, right? And so it's indeterminate. It's not considered a criminal case, right? It's a civil case, right? So you're not afforded the same rights as if you for example, you don't get access to a lawyer, right, for free, or a phone call sometimes. And so it's a different process, but it happens to happen in the same kind of spaces where people who are facing time spend their sentence or whatever. So it's in general we kind of see this convergence of criminalization with immigration policies, which has been dubbed crimmigration, right? And detention really happens to be one of the spaces where we see this very explicitly, right? Where immigrants are facing again a civil procedure, but they experience it as punishment or as incarceration, right? Even though it's not supposed to be incarceration, right? And on average, I think right now the numbers are people are spending about a month in detention, but in terms of the work that I've been doing for the past 4 years, we've seen cases where people spend up to 3-4 years in detention, right? Just waiting out their case. So you can see, right, it's supposed to be a civil procedure, it's indeterminate, and it can go on for years, right? And during this time, we were really trying to, better understand what actually happens to people who are in the detention process. So far, in terms of understanding what we know about gay and transgender immigrants in detention, there haven't really been too many academic studies. So there's been some studies, not really sociological studies, but really we know mostly about this through organizations like CIVIC, which is a national organization of visitation programs, Detention Watch Network. So some of these organizations that some of you all may be familiar with, right? And then just some activists, volunteers that have been able to get some word out, newspaper articles, right? So it's very much scattered, and there really hasn't been much done on what happens, or the consequences, right, of health and well-being for immigrants who are gay and transgender, or gay or transgender in immigrant detention. And so really my study is really trying to fill this gap, right? In terms of bridging community work and organizing and academic sociological studies, right? So this is really, trying to fill this gap. So my questions are, what is the state of mental and physical health of immigrants in detention? So this is a very broad question, but in this presentation I'm only focusing on gay or transgender immigrants. Second question is, how do detention facilities address the health needs of immigrants? So for here, I'm really trying to understand what facilities are doing in order to address the needs, right, of immigrants who are supposed to be taken care of. And then finally, how do the health risks and experiences vary by gender and sexuality? So again, in this presentation, I'm focusing only on gay or transgender immigrants in detention. So the methodology, I'm going to try and go through this very quickly. So this is part of a larger project in collaboration with Sociological. And really our aim is to interview 100 immigrants in detention. So far we're about a third of the way through, and also interview family members down the line, which seems like it's going to be a little far away, but eventually we'll get to interview family members. So again, this is sort of positioned as part of a larger project and trying to understand detention, right? So we know a lot about what happens to immigrants who fear deportation, maybe experience deportation as well, right, from a lot of literature. But we know much less about what actually happens to folks who are in the detention process, right? And as I mentioned earlier, this detention process can go for years, right? And so the way I sliced this study is to coincide with a larger project. So what we typically do is interview people during regular visitation hours. And so we're just like any other visitors. We go in, visitation hours are sometimes half an hour, sometimes an hour. And then during this hour, we just talk to people about a series of questions about their experiences prior to detention, immigration history, and really broad questions, but also just trying to get a sense of overall what they're going through. And then for the help, so for that, it's just, it usually takes 2 to 3 visits, sometimes a little bit more. And then I go in and conduct a health interview, which all takes about 1 or 2 visits. And so the sample size, at least for this paper, is going to be 15 gay or transgender Latinas and 15 Latinos. And I'm focusing only on Latinos and Latinas here because we're doing other work that compares the experiences of Latinos and African migrants. So that's like another paper. And as we know, Latinos are overrepresented in detention. And so when I conduct a health interview, I talk to folks about the health in their home country, health in the United States, coping strategies, interactions with officials, interactions with other people in detention. And there's very many varied trajectories. So there's some people that have never stepped foot in the United States besides just being in detention. There's people that have been permanent residents and then have ended up in detention, right? And so have spent years in the United States, right? So the trajectories are very varied. But one way or another, people end up in detention. A lot of times it's because of a minor crime, or mostly minor crimes, at least for the sample that I'm focusing on. And also supplementing this just with some community events and formal conversations with organizers who are doing this kind of work, right? And so the way that I'm designing this presentation, so I'm kind of trying it out. So rather than, so one of the obstacles of doing this type of work is that we can't record while we visit. It happens during regular visitation hours. And so what we do is we talk to somebody, have a conversation, and immediately after we do a voice recording and then try to recreate the interview post-hoc, right? And usually we don't go alone, and so I can talk a little bit more about positionality later on, but it's usually myself and another undergraduate researcher. So we go in together, and then this helps us recreate the interview, right, and try to get a better sense. And since we visit more than once, we try to get a live history approach, So it kind of helps triangulate the data in that way. So I'm going to present 3 cases that are kind of emblematic of some of my main findings so far in terms of my research questions and just doing this kind of work. So the first one, so I'm really finding that, so not only do people have prior existing medical conditions and mental health issues, but the detention process really just serves to exacerbate it and make it a lot worse, right? And so we know in general that immigrants tend to be healthier than native-born folks, but at least for this population, we also understand that there's a lot of obstacles that people who are gay or transgender face, including discrimination, a lack of access to proper medical care. So even without being in detention, there's already issues around this population, right? And detention just makes it a lot worse. So for Juliana, one of the things that when we started talking, one of the things that really stood out was that she had spent some time incarcerated previously for about a year, but during this time she did experience sexual violence, and so she was raped while in jail. And so she talks about this as as one of the ways that people who are transgender are very vulnerable, right? Because they're typically housed in the general population, and so the idea behind this field site, this detention facility that's only for gay or transgender immigrants, is to protect them, right, from being in these sort of spaces, right, and from maybe experiencing sexual violence, right. But we see in Juliana's case, she experienced it in either case, and so we kind of understand that just in general, these spaces of confinement are unsafe spaces, and so no matter what you do, no matter even if you have this separate mod, people still experience sexual violence, verbal abuse, and all types of abuses. And really, because of this, Juliana kind of talks about her experiences in regards to health as somebody who's gone through a lot of trauma, and she sort of talked about having multiple lives, right? She's been she feels like she's lived 3 or 4 lives because of her experience. So she's from Mexico, first generation transgender woman who left home when she was about 13 years old, moved to Tijuana, and there to get by, she worked as a sex worker, right? And so also faced a lot of discrimination from police officers, from people that she worked with, and so that was half her story, right? And then coming to the United States, it was another half of experiencing discrimination while living in San Francisco, which is supposed to be like one of the safer spaces, but still experiencing discrimination and policing in terms of like, again, she had to return to sex work because that was really one of the few avenues where she could make some money. So she experienced policing on that end, and so all of this kind of combined led her to end up in detention, right? And one of the things that she told us is that in detention, at least for her experience, there are no therapists that speak Spanish, for one, and counselors typically give negative information or incorrect information, right? And so one of the things that really has stood out is that if you were to ask somebody who's transgender in detention, more likely than not, they're just going to tell you that a police officer, a counselor, just tells them, like, why are you the way you are? So instead of working with them through issues, they just question their gender identity from the very beginning, right? And so they offer solutions of like, why don't you just stop dressing like a woman, or why don't you just change your name? So they have an incorrect assumption or understanding of what it means to be transgender, and so they sort of apply their gender norms and give this type of advice that doesn't really help people who are transgender and have faced previous trauma, right? And either in their home country or in the U.S., right? And so it just makes it a lot worse, right? And so there's just a general lack of like trained health counselors or therapists, and like language becomes another issue, right? Like this person who works in this facility, it's only through a video monitor, so they're not even in person. Even if you do want to talk to them, and if you do, you have to go through a translator. So again, it becomes just one of the obstacles. Like if you have mental health issues, you can't really talk to somebody and get help. So another one of the salient aspects for this population has really been about negotiating identity. So for Mario, so he identifies as a gay man, and he immigrated to the United States when he was 18 years old. He has been in the US for 18 years. So half his life he spent in Mexico, the rest here in the US. And I think for him, like the interesting part about his story is that he transferred from the gay mod to the transgender mod. And so when we think about this, like he talks about it in the ways of like how your identity again is in some ways questioned, policed, right? Not only by guards and officials who don't have a very good understanding of what it means to be transgender or even what it means to be gay, and they just assume based on what you look like, how you speak, things like that, right? And so this is one of the things where that just in general, like, there's just like a lack of understanding and lack of training in these facilities, even though this is supposed to be the one designated space right in the United States. And so for Anna, she talks a lot about like what it means to be in solitary confinement. So again, like one of the strategies has been to place people, like if they're not held in this one designated facility, they're held in solitary confinement. And so the argument being that solitary confinement can also have like negative health consequences and be detrimental to your well-being. But for Anna, she sort of questions even just the role of these separate spaces, and I mentioned that people go, like even though you're in the same mod, officers will treat you differently, right? And they'll give different treatment for some versus others, right? And so like the space itself, even though it's supposed to be this protective safe space, just serves to reproduce inequalities, right? Based on interactions between officers and people, and then just people who are in detention with one another, right? In terms of like questioning, are you really transgender or are you really whatever, right? And so this happens more often than not, and again, so it's kind of like the unintended consequence of like having this space where then now you're in a position where you have to like reaffirm your identity, but also have it questioned constantly, and this has like a detrimental effect on your well-being, right? And how you think about yourself, but also how you think about yourself in relation to others. So I'll just conclude with that. I mean, overall, it's not good, the outlook, and even having these kinds of spaces which are supposed to be safer, better, we still see a lot of issues, right, in terms of health and well-being for immigrants who are gay and transgender. Thank you.
Time for Q&A, so I'm going to speed through my own presentation. Very briefly, this is sort of coming a full circle from how Elliot started with sort of the history of immigration and what it means to have comprehensive immigration reform. And my work today focuses on this shift from illegality to criminality. And basically, if we sort of I start with the quote of Donald Trump announcing he ran for the presidential nomination of the Republican Party, where he explicitly links crime with Mexican immigrants. But if we look at what Obama said when he released DAPA, the program for parents, he sort of says that our focus is on criminal aliens, felons, not families, criminals, not children. But if we look at who these criminal aliens are being deported, 70 to 80% of those criminal aliens are from Mexico. So talking about sort of the focus on criminal aliens is really a colorblind way of talking about deportation that targets Latinos in general and Mexicans in particular. And so these today's presentation sort of focuses on this puzzle. What happened in 1980? About 381 immigrants were deported for criminal or narcotics violations, according to INS. By 2000, 71,000 migrants were deported for criminal or narcotics violations. That's 186 times as many as 1980. So what happened in this period from the 1980s to 2000? And my argument is that this really starts sort of with the racialized anxieties of human refugees in the 1980s. Then throughout the 80s and the 90s, there's an expansion of criminality through bureaucratic changes and legal changes. And at the end of the day today, because of demographics, because the larger share of the undocumented population is Mexican, then that means that when we expand the boundaries of criminality, most people who end up being affected are Mexican immigrants. So the third wave of Cuban migration to the United States began in April 20, 1980, and this new wave was composed of mostly poor and non-white Cubans, as opposed to the previous wave. And so there were sort of a lot of anxieties about reports that the Castro regime had sent people from mental facilities and prisons in boats to the United States, but there was no real sense of how many criminals were included in this huge wave. In 5 months, from April to September, about 125,000 Cuban migrants had arrived in the United States, and so how many of these people were real, criminals who were coming from Cuban prisons? The White House argued that about 2%, about 4,000 immigrants were coming from this background, but the New York Times was reporting that it was 40,000 people. So it was no clear sense. And so the Governmental Accountability Office, which is a research branch of the federal government, started inquiring into this new issue of criminal aliens. And so basically, in this paper, I sort of argued that they helped establish that criminal aliens was an issue of importance, and then they also started to give ideas on how to address this issue. And they sort of argued that there were 3 problems. One is that we didn't have a way to hold criminal aliens and deport them right away after they were released from prisons in the U.S. If they committed a crime in the U.S., they were released from prisons without being deported immediately. There were no facilities to hold all these criminal aliens that were being, that should have been detained by INS, and that there was a limited database to identify criminal aliens. So they sort of suggested the solutions for these 3 problems, and these problems and solutions eventually get incorporated by the Immigration and Naturalization Service. So there were, they instituted certain bureaucratic changes, like the institutional hearing program, that then allowed INS to hold hearings in prisons and make deportations more sort of expedient. They increased bedsides to hold immigrants, and so this is sort of the emergence of the detention centers that are here nowadays. And they also improved the database to then have information about who these criminal aliens are. But these bureaucratic changes were also accompanied by legal changes that then increase the boundaries of legality. The concept of aggravated felony, it's kind of invented, right? That it's not just a felony, but for immigration purposes, certain misdemeanors are considered felonies. And so there's the merge of the immigration law and criminal law, not only internally by focusing on criminal aliens, but also at the border with programs like Operation Streamline that really starts to prosecute a large number of undocumented immigrants entering and re-entering unauthorized. And so we see sort of like the consequence of these shift from illegality to criminality in that, before, you could, if you were an unauthorized immigrant, you could change that by, maybe IRCA, like a program, a legalization program. Today, if you're deported as a criminal alien, there's a ban for you to return illegally to the United States. And so, again, this continues to be a very racialized and class and gender process, where most of those deported as criminal aliens remain to be Mexican, working class Mexican. So that's sort of like in a nutshell my argument in this paper, and if you want a copy of my presentation, but I also want to leave about the last 15 minutes for Q&A for all these sort of like papers that were just amazing, and sort of all this process that I think in many ways highlights the way that immigrants are shaped by legality and illegality from the from the structural issues that are represented to the intimacy of the family and relationships, to then labor and detention centers. So let's open the floor for questions and answers.
This question is to Dr. Rosales, the vendor. I know you talk about how ordinances, in a way, also can be almost like immigration enforcement laws, but I wanted to know what is the role that the community plays, specifically when there are communities, for instance, currently in Southeast Los Angeles, there's communities who are mobilizing that they don't want the taco stands, they don't want the taco vendors. So what is the role that also the community plays, because it seems there's tension even within the community. I know that you didn't talk about this, but maybe one of your chapters you did talk, one of the other chapters you did talk about the role that the community plays besides the ordinance.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm having to rewrite part of the introduction now to include a legalization campaign that's very active, the Los Angeles Street Vendor Campaign, which is trying to get rid of this ban, right, with a lot of activism. And so, you're asking like the other side, which is like communities that don't want vendors, which is really like, it's a really interesting, because in the years that I spent in the field, the only time that I saw that sort of outrage against street vendors was in the context of neighborhood associations. And so I went to a few neighborhood association meetings because it was on the agenda that they were going to discuss the nuisance of street vendors. And so, and luckily I had a friend at the time who was also doing research on neighborhood associations. And so she ended up telling me about one meeting, and then I found the data or the interview sort of transcript of that meeting. And what was really fascinating was that this often happens, and neighborhood associations complain to the LAPD that they want to get rid of their street vendors. But at least in a few instances that I did track it, the LAPD response in this context of the neighborhood association was, we have bigger problems. And so even though you would like us to police street vendors in these communities that we're looking at, gangs are more of a threat. So it was interesting that, again, this is like the LAPD public spokesperson talking to a neighborhood association, trying to tell them, yeah, we hear your complaints, but in the grand scheme of things, we're not going to do this. And so that was really interesting to me because I would never expect the LAPD to tell a neighborhood association, which has some like clout, that we're not going to do what you want us to do, right? But at the same time, you have independent business. It's not necessarily residents, but it ends up being business owners who have a lot of cachet, who end up calling the cops on street vendors. And so there is some antagonism between the communities that vendors work in and whether or not people want them there. But one of the things that I talk about in my paper, because my book is on street vendors, is how they're constantly trying to create relationships, not only with their customers, but with the neighborhood, with the businesses in their area, so that the businesses become their advocates, right? And so I have a whole chapter devoted to how vendors try to create social ties with those around them, from like the parking lot attendants to the bank managers, so that not only do they protect them, but they become their friends and advocates, so that they don't call the cops on them, right? So it's interesting that I didn't see so much antagonism from the people, but it's because I'm focusing on the vendors and all the work that they do to limit the antagonism that they might face from people in the neighborhood.
Thank you very much for answering that question. I'm very interested in community dynamics. That's why.
Yes, hi, great panel. Thank you so much for sharing your research. I have a question for Dr. Rosales as well, and also one for Lucia. I'm interested in knowing more about the gendering processes, especially for women who are street vendors. Can you provide, I don't know, preliminary information maybe on like the experiences of women, and maybe does policing happen in the community too by even officers or the same community as well? Because, you know, being a street vendor and being a Latina immigrant woman, dark skin is a very different experience from a male. So just wanted to know if that's part of your analysis.
You want to ask both questions?
Yeah, and then for Lucia, wonderful, congratulations, graduate student. You know, you make the community very proud, and so do you, graduate students. If you could also share a little bit about, like, I wanted to know about the factor of education as an indicator. How does that shape love and these relationships in any way? I mean, just education. I don't think I heard that quite well with the methods. How does education shape their legalization through marriage?
Sure. So the majority of the participants that I interviewed were either in community college or there were some grad students as well, so a lot of junior education. And for, I think, the ones in community college, the majority of them went through DACA first. And sort of also, I think something particularly interesting about that is that DACA sort of served not only as the pathway to sort of do this loophole, but also as a way to delay this like uncomfortable possibility, right? That they didn't have to get married right away. They had this ability to sort of delay the process by a couple of years or a different set of years. Whereas for those that were in grad programs or were no longer in school, that went straight into work opportunities, they felt a little more pressing sort of to have this marital trajectory go as quickly as possible. And I think those decisions were made pre-DACA. So now the decision was DACA or marriage, and at that point they're like in their late 20s without sort of these pathways to employment as engineers or as working professionals, and so then the decision to marry was sort of more of a quick, streamlined process. But that's probably the biggest difference I've seen so far. But all the women participants are had at least some college education.
So, like I said, the majority of the people, the majority of the individuals in my study are men. And there were a few women. So most of the men, they're between 19 and 25, very young. And the same pattern existed for the women. So, and again, very, very small sample. I had 3 women, 2 of them were vendors. Actually, now that I think about it, I think 3 vendors. So 2 of them were young women, left like around in their 20s, early 20s. One was a woman who was in her 40s, kind of more kind of like what you would think of as women street vendors and other sort of selling other products, right? And then there was a woman who was a cart owner, so she wasn't actually on the street. She was in her 40s also. And so what became because it's such a small sample, I don't want to have a gender chapter, but I do end up talking about in the book how gender manifested itself in the relationships that they had with customers and the relationships that they had with cops. And so one of the two young women was always getting hit on the street, and it was really problematic. And then after a while, she was like, you know what, I'm just gonna embrace it. Like she's like, I'm not gonna dress down. She's just gonna dress sexy. And she's like, I'm just gonna use them to buy more things. And then she put out a tip jar. Because she's like, you know, I might as well, like if they want to flirt with me, tip, you know? And so Carmen, who was another one of these vendors that I spent a lot of time with, also, it was really interesting because like two LAPD officers would come and buy fruit from her. And I actually have pictures of the LAPD officers because like I would be with Carmen and then they would come by and as soon as they would drive up, they would buy fruit, but they would be like, Carmen, when are you going to hook us up with your cousins? And they would have this discussion because they were Latinos, they would speak in Spanish. So it was like a really playful interaction. They would buy from the fruit vendor, they would flirt. And then when I sold in the summer, like I also noticed like the flirtation. Like not only the flirtation, but like how being in a public space really makes you an object to people. So like it was blatant sometimes where instead of standing next to you to order a fruit, some of the men would like literally stand behind you and just like go, yeah, that's what I want. You know, like but talking about the product, but they're standing behind you and you know, like as I'm doing research and I'm like, oh, this is really unpleasant, but this is data. And so I'm talking about, in the book, their experiences in that front. Whereas with men, when they interacted with police officers, they weren't nearly as friendly or definitely not flirtatious, mostly because the cops were men. But the police officers with the fruit vendors would sometimes try to use them as kind of eyes upon the street, which is an extension of like Mitch Denier's work, right? They would, in one instance, there was the vendor working outside of a 7-Eleven that had gotten robbed. And so for like a week after, the LAPD would like roll through very slowly and tell this, like ask the vendor, everything calm? And the vendor would be like, yeah. So like the vendor became like the de facto kind of surveillance for the cops because he was always there and he was vigilant. But again, in the book, I talk about this really complicated relationship where one day they're friendly with the cops and the next day they're going to arrest them. Right? So, and that's how the gender is like kind of manifesting itself.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you.
I always have multiple questions. This is for Lucia. I know you spoke a lot about minority or women and you're trying to get more even of men and women. But can you talk, in your presenter didn't really spoke about that. Can you talk about the men, what you found about the men that you did interview based on your preliminary findings?
Sure. So I did sort of skip over some of the quotes. I think actually I really skipped over all the quotes that I had from men, so I'm sorry for that. That was not on purpose. I think actually the interviews with men, initially when I first started doing interviews, were a lot shorter, like significantly shorter than when I spoke to women. And so I really had to sort of take a step back and talk to my advisors and talk to some people about sort of what was going on. And so it took some time to look over interviews again and sort of read the transcripts and see opportunities where maybe I wasn't engaging as much or I needed to engage differently. And so I started to find some cues sort of, so particularly when they talk about their decision-making